My name is James Preston Allen. I'm the publisher of Random Links News. And this is our maiden voyage for our interview program that will air on Long Beach Radio and Random Links News YouTube channel. We are here the day before Charles Bukowski's 100th birthday, which is August 18th. 16th.
Yep.
And I have invited R.D. Armstrong, who is a poet from Long Beach and the publisher of Lummox Press, and John Dolahan, who is the filmmaker for Born Into This, which is, I believe, the last documentary that was made on the life and times of Charles Bukowski. So welcome, gentlemen. Please, Rain Dog, give us a couple words from you, and then we'll ask John for a couple.
Well, I'm Rain Dog. I have been Rain Dog for about a quarter of a century, so I think I have bragging rights to that. Yes, and I used to live in San Pedro, which is where I met James. I've published the Lummox Press for the last 26 years, and due to a change in my fortunes, I'm going to take a sabbatical from publishing for a while and move into my next project, which I'm already doing, which is giving out money to people in need. So I'm now a two-prong operation, and of course I am the bargain basement Bukowski scholar. So it's good to have a gig, you know. When Jerry Loughlin's not available, and whoever else, you know, Mike Meloan and all these guys, when they're not available to talk about the old man, they come to me.
Very good. So, John, give us a little background on who you are and your credentials as to the Bukowski legacy.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm the even more of a extra bargain basement guy as well. I it's been a while now, directed Bukowski Born Into This, I think one of the only, or the most definitive of the comprehensive documentaries on his life. And it was released in 2005, so it's been out for a while. And basically what I did was I took almost 10 years of my life and researched Bukowski, and I did a ton of interviews, many of which did not make it into the film. But some did, and you know, yeah, that's about it. I mean, I was really lucky because I got to a lot of people while they were still among us, and I got to meet people that worked with them in the post office. I had many long talks with Frances Dean Smith, who of France I was a poet, and Marina's mother, and then I talked to people right through till the very end, many of whom were in San Pedro. So,
and it was
wonderful,
a very interesting documentary that I enjoyed rewatching again because I was there at the premiere. Where was that premiere held? It was up in Hollywood someplace.
Yeah, the ArcLight.
The ArcLight Theater, yeah. Rain Dog, you had a comment.
No, I just was saying hello to my friend Linda Lerner from New York City, who's on the down in the lower quadrant there. Hi, Linda. Should I tell her that her mic is off?
Well, let's move on here.
Let's just leave it that way. Okay.
So the premise of what Random Links News is going to publish on August 20th of this month is sort of a analysis of one of Bukowski's more controversial poems. And the name of that poem is Dinosaurius We. It was something that my editor came across, and it is the basis for the title of John Dullahan's Born Into This, because the refrain in Dinosaurius We is "We are born into this." And I believe that is where, John, you got the title for your documentary, correct?
Yes, yes, indeed. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, Rain Dog,
Yes, James.
give us your reading of the actual poem.
Okay, I have to premise this with the fact that I still don't believe that this is a Bukowski poem, but I'll read it.
Okay, because we're going to get into that.
Yeah, we're going to get into that.
We're
Yeah.
going to get into that.
I don't mind if I make a complete ass of myself. You know, it makes it more entertaining. It's like J.B. Kennedy and me.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a poem that's attributed to Bukowski. My research says it was probably written in the mid 70s. Okay, Dinosauria We. Born like this, into this, as the chalk faces smile, as Mrs. Death laughs, as the elevators break, as political landscapes dissolve, as supermarket bag boy holds a college degree, as the oily fish spit out their oily prey, as the sun is masked. We are born like this, into these carefully mad wars, into the sight of broken factory windows of emptiness, into bars where people no longer speak to each other, into fistfights that end as shootings and knifings, born into this, into hospitals which are so expensive that it's cheaper to die, into lawyers who charge so much it's cheaper to plead guilty, into a country where the jails are full and the madhouses are closed, into a place where the masses elevate fools into rich heroes, born into this, walking and living through this, dying because of this, muted because of this, castrated, debauched, disinherited because of this, fooled by this, used by this, pissed on by this, made crazy and sick by this, made violent, made inhuman by this. The heart is blackened, the fingers reach for the throat, the gun, the knife, the bomb. The fingers reach towards an unresponsive God. The fingers reach for the bottle, the pill, the powder. We are born into this sorrowful deadliness. We are born into a government 60 years in debt that soon will be unable to even pay the interest on that debt. And the banks will burn. Money will be useless. There will be open and unpunished murder in the streets. It will be guns and roving mobs. Land will be useless. Food will become a diminishing return. Nuclear power will be taken over by the many. Explosions will continually shake the earth. Radiated robot men will stalk each other. The rich and the chosen will watch from space platforms. Dante's Inferno will be made to look like a children's playground. Sorry. The sun will not be seen, and it will always be night. Trees will die. All vegetation will die. Radiated men will eat the flesh of radiated men. The sea will be poisoned. The lakes and rivers will vanish. Rain will be the new gold. The rotting bodies of men and animals will stink in the dark wind. The last few survivors will be overtaken by new and hideous diseases. The space platforms will be destroyed by attrition, the petering out of supplies, the natural effect of general decay, and there will be the most beautiful silence never heard, born out of that. The sun still hidden there, awaiting the next chapter. There it is. You know, I understand that, I James, you pointed out that, it's pretty remarkable, some of the stuff that's in this poem, of how current it is with today's situation. And I think that that's right. And, disregarding the fact that I don't believe that Bukowski wrote this poem, that doesn't mean it's not a good poem. Whoever wrote it was probably feeling pretty good about themselves. But it's a classic list poem, which is what Bukowski wrote a lot of. But in my experience with Bukowski, I don't remember him ever being political. And I talked to Mike Meloan about that, and he said that Bukowski was one of the most apolitical poets he'd ever met. And this is definitely not apolitical.
No, but it is prophetic.
Well, it's prophetic, but I agree that it's a prophetic poem for, considering the time it was written in, that 30 years later, 50 years later, it would be suddenly be germane again. I don't argue with that. But
so, John, you looked this poem up, didn't you?
Well, it came out, I'm sure as we're all aware, it came out in 1992. It was published in the Last Night of the Earth poems.
No wonder I haven't read it.
Yeah. Which isn't to say it couldn't have been written earlier, but, and the one to ask would be Martin, John Martin, his publisher. But it did come, Last Night of the Earth poems came out, 1992. It was the last book of poems published during his lifetime.
Right.
And to me, it sounds like Bukowski. What sounds like Bukowski to me is sort of his lack. How do I put it? Lack of confidence in the human race. That's a really nice way of putting it. But he really. I'm not surprised that he would write a poem where mankind completely obliterates itself. That kind of sounds like Bukowski to me. And it was written. I know at this time he. If you read like some of the last stuff he wrote were his journals, and they were written around the same time, a little bit afterwards, and he's thinking a lot about death. He's feeling like there's something in his body that doesn't quite feel right, and he thinks that he might be getting sick again. This was after he'd had a bout with TB in the late 80s. And then I know he was talking about he had very few political poems. You're right about that. But I did hear interviews where he was talking about Clinton coming into power, and if you remember, we were going through a kind of a recession at that time. So this sort of reminds me of some of the things that were going on in his life at that time, and which affected his perspective. But I would just say, I'd be curious to ask Martin what the story was behind this. It does have a, you're right though, there are parts of it that almost seem like, it sort of has a science fiction element, which it is really unique for Bukowski. I have to say, that's my.
Although I have to admit that it was actually during the few years before his death that he did give his only ever commercial endorsement to our newspaper. And our newspaper has never been shy about dealing with politics. And yet, Hank, for whatever reason, decided that he was going to do that. And the curious part about it was the way in which I was introduced to him. You see, I had known Linda Bukowski for a number of years. And I had seen Hank at the post office on multiple times because he and I would show up at the post office almost on a daily basis. And here this guy was that nobody knew in San Pedro, fumbling in his pocket for his key to his P.O. box because he was there, looking to get his royalty checks. And I knew who he was, but nobody else did. But I never, came up and said, oh, I'm a great fan or any of that, BS. And yet, at one point over on 6th Street, I ran into Linda Bukowski walking with Hank through the arcade building. And I said hello to Linda. And she turned around and said, oh, Hank, here's the guy that writes that newspaper that you like to read. And he turned around and looked at me and said, oh, so you're the guy. I only read 2 newspapers, yours and the Daily Racing Form. And I was completely shocked. I didn't even know what to say at that point. And it slowly dawned on me that the most well-known poet in America at the time had just paid me a humongous compliment. And I later asked him if he really meant it. And of course he said yes. But so that's how I actually ended up meeting him. And, the rest is pretty much history, except for the night of drinking in which Hank, Linda, my wife Suzanne, and I ended up drinking till 4 o'clock in the morning with Hank after we took that notorious photograph of him.
Mm.
And that was in what year was that, James? Was that?
It was like just a couple years before he passed away. Because soon after that, another curious incident happened. And it was right around the time of the first Gulf War. I had invited the famous Nation magazine columnist Alex Coburn to come to San Pedro. And Alex, for whatever reason, maybe he took pity on our newspaper or something. He came down and we did this, public, speech thing, at Harbor College. And I gave him a tour of the harbor. And then we went out to dinner at Senfuku. And as we walked in to Senfuku, we walked down, there's that long bar there. Hank was sitting at the end of the bar in the place that he loved to sit, drinking a tall Sapporo and eating sushi. And so we went to our table, sat down, and I immediately thought to myself, now wouldn't this be just a classic conversation to have this nationally known, political columnist for the Nation magazine, and to hear what he would have to say to America's most well-known poet. And so I immediately got up and invited Hank to come over to our table. And most of you who had met Bukowski know that he was kind of shy, actually, except when he was put with a bottle of beer in front of 300 fans, chanting for him to get, angry. But he was, on a personal level, he was kind of shy. So after a little cajoling, he actually came over, sat down with his beer, and I introduced him to Alex Coburn. Now, I totally expected for there to be this great intellectual conversation that took place about literature or politics or, you name it. But you know what they talked about? They talked about their cats. And they talked about their cats, not just for a little bit, as though it was like, preliminary, discussion on something else. But they talked about cats for the whole goddamn meeting, the whole damn dinner, And I was just absolutely flummoxed. My wife was absolutely enthralled because my wife is a cat person too, But this was sort of like, interviewing Hemingway with Edward R. Murrow, and all they want to talk about is Hemingway's cats in Havana. It was hilarious. It was an absolutely hilarious episode.
Yeah, in my case, I was more of a fan from a distance because I'd had opportunities to go visit Bukowski when he lived in Los Angeles, and I opted not to go, mostly because of his reputation. And what I realized was that his reputation was based on his alter ego, which is the character of Chinaski.
Right.
And that's actually, I'm doing an anthology right now. In fact, Linda Singer and I don't know if Linda Neal's in it. I don't remember. It's all a blur at this point. Linda, yeah, okay, and Linda Lerner's in it too, I think. You're in the Bukowski thing, right, Linda? Yeah, okay. So it's basically a tribute to Bukowski by fans of Bukowski. And it's surprising the men tend to write more about the swaggering, drunken, macho crap, and the women tend to write more about if Bukowski could just be made more sensitive and what a great guy he'd be and this kind of thing. And I thought, wow, this is just going to be really a strange anthology. What the hell? But the book, but the name of the anthology is Last Call, Chinaski. So the Chinaski oeuvre lives on.
And so we're sort of stuck in terms of this legacy. And John, I would like you to talk a little bit about that, because I think you touched on it a lot in the documentary. There is this dichotomy. Bukowski and his alter ego, Chernowski, and then the man himself, who in many respects had his flaws, but in many respects was perhaps more shy and less bombastic, perhaps, shall I say. But John, tell us the perception that you came away from after spending, 7 years producing this documentary on him?
Yeah, well, what I found, it was fascinating learning about him, because for everything you can say about him on one side, you can say about him on the other. He was sensitive, sweet, but he could be really mean and cruel. And he loved animals and he hated people. And, he could write these really wonderful, sensitive poems like The Bluebird, and then he could write erections, ejaculations, and Tales of Ordinary Madmen. But, actually, I did some research on his family. And what I came away with was that, if you take a really sensitive, kind-hearted person and they are born into the life that he was born into, which is the mother who basically emotionally abandoned him, who stood by and said nothing while the father was beating him. I think she did say something. I think said, the father is always right. You know, your father is always right.
Right. I
And
remember that.
this happened continually throughout his childhood. So you come out of that with somebody who doesn't bond with their mother, and what that does is it can create the person's kind of working model of the world as being one where you kind of instinctively don't trust people. You instinctively kind of are afraid to get too close to them. You don't know how to relate to them. Your view of the world is that it is unsafe. That's typically what can happen if somebody doesn't have a mother there that loves them and nurtures them and protects them. And then on the other side, you have the father that's beating him all the time and that's trying to shove this view of success down his throat of, work hard and buy a house and then save money and then buy 2 homes. And it's kind of the American dream, sort of a Horatio Alger thing that, we kind of grew up on the tail end of that. But so I think if you have sort of a sensitive, artistic person growing up in that kind of environment, I think it kind of makes sense what he was, which is sort of a sensitive, kind-hearted, humanistic person who got twisted into this sort of, he was traumatized. He was traumatized and he never really worked that out in his life. And you see it in the very last things he wrote, and so that's kind of how I see it. So that sets up the dynamics for the kind of contradictions that you're talking about. He felt very comfortable in yelling and screaming relationships because that's what he grew up with. He felt very comfortable with women who would abandon him on some level and who would yell and scream at him because that's what he grew up with. You know what I mean? So I think, like those early relationships kind of set the foundation for what comes later. It's not all about that, certainly our later relationships play a big part too, and we can encounter all sorts of things at different points in our life. But I think sort of as a starting point and a way of understanding him, that's sort of how I came to understand him.
But didn't you interview a couple of his friends? I vaguely remember the documentary, and there was an interview with one guy who knew Bukowski as a kid and was surprised when you told him how he was described in one of Bukowski's books, one of his fictions, and because that wasn't who he was, and he was kind of surprised about that. Didn't you interviewed that guy, right?
There was one woman who I interviewed. Her name is Beverly. I'll remember after this interview. I'll remember her.
Of course.
Beverly Knox. She knew. This is just one of those amazing interviews where it's like you meet. It's like walking into a time machine. Right? She knew Bukowski when he went to LACC in the 40s. Would have been in the 40s or early 50s, 40s. And she hung out with him. And she went over. So not only did she know him when he was like 20, but she went over to the house and she met the parents. And the way she described him was he was very quiet and he didn't drink a lot in front of them. He did one time and he ended up throwing up all over the bathtub and stealing their typewriter. And then he went to and then he was on his way to Philadelphia the next day, right? Which is where he had his barfly chapter. But but what I did was I was so obsessed with this, who was getting to the root of who Bukowski was. I actually brought to the interview, I brought the Barbet Schroeder tapes. And I showed her just a clip. I said, well, is this like the Bukowski that you remember? And on the Barbet Schroeder tapes, he's drunk and he's talking. She said, well, yes, that's Hank. That's good old Hank. They knew him as good old Hank, And she said, he was kind of philosophical. He really was. And he was quiet. and he had these eyes, and you never knew what was going on behind his eyes. And what was kind of ironic was he had met her husband at it's my dog, sorry, he's adding his perspective. They had met as journalism students at LACC, and there was a third friend they had, Robert Baum, who actually is written about in Ham on Rye. And so of the three journalism students, Robert Baum was considered the talented one, and they kind of didn't really think much of Hank's writing. And Robert Baum was killed in World War II. And Hank, I think, writes about that in Ham on Rye. So yeah, so what I saw, her view, that was her view of him. So it wasn't the rough, tough barfly guy, but it was like good old Hank, And she said that I was over it. Hank invited us over to his parents' house. And she described the father as being kind of mean and kind of gruff and not very personable. And Beverly brought over, they had just had a little girl, and she brought her little daughter over. She was just a baby. And Hank's mother was saying, "Oh, Hank, look at that baby. Don't you want one of these days?" Like, the mom wanting the grandkid. And she said, Hank just like, was just like really embarrassed and just tried to, crawl under the carpet if he could have. But yeah, it was a fascinating interview. Yeah.
And one of the interviews that you did in that documentary was the mother of Hank's only child.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about how you got that interview.
I met, well, she was known as Franci, but
Right.
when I met her, Frances Dean Smith was her name. And how did I meet her? I don't remember. I met her early on in the interviewing process, and she was just fascinating because she lived with Bukowski during the time when he was working in the post office, really struggling in the early 60s. And so what he would do is he would work the night shift. He'd come home around 4 or 5. He'd sleep till about noon, and then he'd do his writing through the afternoon, and then he'd go to work around 6. So, and she would be there, and she would cook him meals, and Marina would be crying, and he'd be trying to write. But she told me, she said, he hated his job, but he had to hold on to his job. So he had to do every year or two, he threw mail, right? Which is the mail would come in, and Bukowski would, all this mail would come in, say like for the city of Los Angeles, and Bukowski would throw the mail into cubby holes, which was in a given zip code. And so he would end up like dividing the mail into sections, which was then subdivided into addresses and so forth.
Carrier routes, yeah.
Yeah, mail routes, yeah. And people, one of his coworkers said, "God, I hated, Oh, and then there was another job Bukowski had earlier where he would lay the mail out and like so that the mailman would put it in the sacks. And one of the ex-postmen said, "I hated it when Bukowski did that because the mail was all fucked up and it was all wrong, and I had to resort it on the route," because Bukowski just didn't care. But by this point, Bukowski, he was writing a lot. He was getting published, and he was trying to just keep the enterprise going. So he had to do these tests where he would throw the scheme, right? And what they would do is they would make you throw mail. They would time you, and you had to have a certain percentage correct. And she said that when Bukowski was like practicing for these things, the sweat would be pouring off him, and he was really afraid that he would lose that job, So she had a lot of those little details that were just, that was fascinating. And she was somebody, she remembered a lot, And so, yeah, she was great. I really liked her. She was a wonderful person.
And then there was the guy you interviewed who worked with him at the
Yes.
post office,
Yes.
who was mentioned in the book, The Post Office, but he changed his name, right? And the Bukowski changed his
Right. I think his
innocent, I guess.
yeah, his name is Dom Muto, and I think he changed it to Tom Moto or something. But he actually he is in several scenes in the novel Post Office where they're delivering mail together, and the truck gets stopped and it gets caught in the rain, and they have to get all the mail out of the truck and all this stuff. And I asked him. I said, did Bukowski, like, you know, there's something about Bukowski's writing. We all know this. It's like, it just has the air of being true, you know, and you find yourself reading his stuff and you read it and you think, gosh, this really sounds like it happened, but it's too wild to really have happened. But boy, it sounds real, you know that feeling. So I asked him about Post Office. I said, how much of that was true? He said, you know, the events were true. He said, but Bukowski funneled it through his point of view, which was that everybody was out to screw him, you know, that the postal bosses were all evil and they were out to screw him up, and that he was just sort of a victim in this whole, you know, Machiavellian Post Office universe. And he said, you know, in my case, he said, I kind of like the job. You know, he said, he said, I raised my family, and he said, and then they promoted me. So I was a supervisor, and I said, Bukowski sure had a lot of harsh things to say about the supervisors. And he says, it's all the way you view your world, the world that you're living in. So he kind of gave me now I also talked to I didn't put this in the film, but I talked to a woman who sorted mail with him, and she was Charlie Mingus's sister, and she worked side by side with Bukowski in the post office at the Terminal Annex. And she and some of the others thought that he was kind of weird. She said, oh yeah, he'd throw the mail and he'd kind of chuckle to himself. You know, something was going on in his head and he would be laughing to himself. And a lot of the other mail sorters thought he was a little odd, but they thought he was okay too. So anyway, yeah, I talked to some of his coworkers. And then one thing I'll tell you is he had a column called Notes of a Dirty Old Man, right. And it ran in the Open City magazine, which was a really, really great underground paper, and it was a rabble rouser kind of paper, and John Bryan ran it.
Free press.
Well, there was the Free Press, but this was Open City. This was just before the Free Press. It just predated it, and then they ran concurrently for a few years. But it only lasted for a few years. But if you ever get a chance to get your hands on some copies of Open City, it's phenomenal. But what happened was the Open City newspaper rack was right in front of the Terminal Annex, right? So they used to load up the Open City rack, and it would come out on a Thursday, and Bukowski would go out and he would take the Open Cities, because he had his columns in there, right? And he'd hide them or throw them away because he didn't want his bosses to see that this is what he was doing, right? And Open City was considered a counterculture, revolutionary, kind of scary paper. And the FBI was actually looking into that paper, and they actually did clamp down on John Bryan, and they were looking into Bukowski too, and particularly because he was a federal employee. So they sent agents around to all the people that knew him and tried to dig up something on him. But but yeah, so he would go to the Open City and box and steal those papers and scurry off with them
Uh,
to save his job.
Scoundrel. Stealing
Scoundrel.
papers. That's
Yeah.
actually now a crime in the state of California. So, Rain Dog, tell us from your perspective what the most influential book that Bukowski wrote that influenced your writing.
I would have to say that it was not a book. It was poems from various books.
Uh-huh.
You know, I never read. I mean, I have my favorites. Don't
Right.
get me wrong, but they weren't like. It wasn't like I read a book and went, "Oh my God, I have to start writing like this." No, I actually started reading him in Open City.
Really?
Yeah,
How
yeah.
long-
When I was in high school, uh,
What year?
it was probably, let's see, 2 years before I graduated, so that would have been 67.
Wow.
Yeah, 67. Somebody told me about this crazy guy that writes a column in this underground newspaper and how wild it is, you know. And so I went to check it out, and I was really excited. And when he switched to the Free Press, I was pretty religious on looking at that, you know, because it had Dr. Hypocrisy or Hip. I can't remember how he pronounced his name, but it was some kind of a hip doctor who would give out cures, not cures, but tell people about how to maintain themselves because we were dealing with a large population of people that were basically bums, and I being one of them. And yeah, so let's see. Well, I really like the book "The Days Run Away Like Wild Horses Over the Hills."
Yeah, that's one of my favorite.
I like that one. I wish I'd been able to see a copy of some of the earlier stuff that's now really expensive. But unfortunately, I didn't even know it existed. So I just went off of what I could get at the Either Or bookstore in Hermosa Beach. Um, I'm just trying to think if it's, you know, there's so much information in my head, and somehow I've lost the key to the door that opens up the library, you know?
I'll get you a locksmith.
I need a locksmith. Yes, yes, that's what I need. Somebody to stick a screwdriver in my head and kind of wiggle it around.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I remember now. Yeah.
The one book that I always recommend to young writers and some journalists is Factotum.
That's a good one. Yeah. Well, and, you know,
Factotum actually, the significance of Factotum, is
this is the only Bukowski book I own that's from the old days because I sold everything I had to make rent back in 08.
And Factotum is, in fact, the definition of the word. The book is in fact the definition, and it is a word that I, previous to reading that book, did not understand the definition of. And so when I read the book, I go, oh. But it's definitely, well, I think, a foundation. You know, if you're going to introduce somebody, a young person, to Bukowski, Factotum is definitely the way to get them warmed up to who he is and his writing style.
Yep. That's a good suggestion. I mean, I've been asked to do that, and I usually say Love is the Dog from Hell, Ham on Rye, Factotum, and Sometimes You Get So Alone, and it doesn't finish that statement. That's the title. Because I think those are all good. One's from very early Bukowski, one's from middle Bukowski, and one's from a little later on. And you know, it's a good overview, and kids love it. You know, that's the one saving grace for Bukowski now is that the kids love him. You know, 20-year-olds they can't get enough of Bukowski, and and that goes back to what you were saying about this how he wrote this poem dinosauria we that could be so good in its time. When he reads it, you hear him at the end of it say, "Oh, this is some heavy shit," and somebody off stage says, "Yeah," and then they say something that's garbled, and that's kind of what I base my idea that this is perhaps not written by Bukowski. But the idea that he could write something back then, assuming that's what he did, and that it would still be applicable now. But I have to just say that history, as we all know, is cyclical, right? So we're going through a time that we already went through in 1918, 1920. We're experiencing that all over again. And maybe it won't be as devastating. I mean, maybe we'll only lose, 10 million people, but still 10 million people is a lot of people. And, we're basically back in that thing. And as I said to you in that little blurb I wrote, I'm having trouble thinking. I'm sorry. Oh, it'll come to me.
Hold that thought for a minute. Hey, John.
Trying to hold that thought.
John, tell us a little bit more about how you were first introduced to Bukowski. Like, what was the first book that you read? How old were you? And sort of what context was it that you?
Yeah, I'd read his stuff a little bit in college, and then I remember I was living in LA, and the Barbet Schroeder tapes were playing at this little place called Easy TV, and I guess he'd been there the night before. So darn, I just missed him, but I went on the wrong night and watched the Barbet Schroeder tapes. So I kind of was familiar with him, but it wasn't until I was actually, I think he had just died. He had, and I was working as an ad agency copywriter, and I was doing my account was the Apple account, so I was doing an Apple ad which featured Henry Rollins. So I was standing around with Henry Rollins, and he mentioned we started talking about books and poetry, and he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "I'm a real fan of Bukowski's," and he said you can still find signed editions of Pulp down at this particular bookstore in Westwood. And so I went down there, and then I just started reading more and more, and it just really got to me. And particularly in my case, I read Post Office, and it was just sort of the inhumane work scene that he describes in Post Offices was what I had been going through, and I really related to it. It was a different, I wasn't working for the U.S. government. I was working in a private corporation, but publicly held.
But you had a certain amount of what shall we say, sympathy for the storyline that resonated with your life.
Oh yeah, I felt like my job was always uncertain. I could get fired at any moment. They worked me to death practically, and I felt ground down by it. And so, but the difference was, it's like, he even though he was in that experience, he was able to create this wonderful piece of writing from that. So I think there's something really encouraging about Bukowski, where the tough times that he went through, he was able to sort of transform those into writing that we can relate to now years later. And Rain Dog, as you're saying, young people read his stuff, and they empathize with it. They feel like somebody's talking to them and understands what they're going through. So
exactly. And the most interesting part through all of this is, in fact, through the post office, through the heavy drinking, through all of the multiple relationships. The one thing is his dedication to sitting down at the typewriter and consistently pounding out words that he believed in. And I don't know how many poems he never submitted, I mean, how many bad poems did he write? And in his in his later years, after his death, they seem to have been scraping the barrel on some of his
Yes,
stuff.
I agree.
Yeah.
But
But
I've never read an Echo book because they just publish whatever they can find without any
right, yeah.
concern about
These are the things that he never thought were actually good enough. But I'll tell you the story of how I came across Bukowski. In about 1973, I'd been living in San Pedro for maybe a couple years. And I ran across this guy by the name of Skip Baldwin, who was an absolute head over heels fan of Charles Bukowski. And he thought that he was going to be Charles Bukowski's best friend pen pal, because he kept writing Bukowski, and this guy Skip was constantly talking about this guy Bukowski. And just because of his personality, I pretty much dismissed what he had to say. Okay. But oddly enough, a few years later, when I was at Harbor College, I had the opportunity to go hear this famous poet out at Cal Arts in, where is Cal Arts? Out in the valley. And of course, this was one of Bukowski's notorious readings, in which he was, drunk, bombastic, and insulting to the audience and whatnot. And I thought this was the best piece of performance art that I had seen in a long time, and began reading some of Bukowski's stuff. The funny part about this story is this, is that this guy Skip, who was such a fan of Bukowski's, decided that he was going to move to Hollywood so that he could partake in the Bukowski scene and possibly run into Bukowski. And it was just about that very same time that Bukowski decided that he was going to move to San Pedro. And Skip never figured it out, I think. So.
What a touching homily.
Yes. So, do we have any questions from our audience today? Please use your raise the hand thing if you have any questions.
You girls are way too quiet. I know that you can talk.
Yeah.
I Zoom with the two Lindas on Sundays. In fact, I'll be Zooming tomorrow.
Right.
You have a menage a trois on Zoom.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. More like 3 people that have to sleep in the same bed,
So, Linda, Neil, give us a question.
I don't really have a question.
How about a comment?
I have regrets that I never, I stood in line to get a book signed many years ago, I think in the early 80s.
Which book?
I never went to hear Bukowski read at the place down in Redondo. What's the name of it? The bar that he...
Sweetwater?
Yeah, Sweetwater. I never went, and I always sad that I never went to see him down there.
It was a classic Bukowski show, I got to tell you.
I'm sure it was, because I've seen it on YouTube, some of it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I've been a fan for a long time. I don't really have any questions, just I'm a fan.
Okay.
I have one book that he signed with one of his little sketches
Yeah.
of his face, you know. So
Miss Singer.
Yes, sir.
So,
You know, I have read several of his poems that were very positive, and I like both. I like all of his work. I like Bukowski. I was watching an Italian documentary on him, and he got upset and he kicked his wife in front of this filming crew, and I'm like going, I'm not too crazy about that behavior.
Did you happen to catch what happened before the kick?
Do you know what it? Do you know
Oh,
what happened?
yeah, I totally know. I know that scene.
Okay.
I think
It
in that.
hurt. I didn't like that, but please tell us what happened before the kick.
Well,
In front of a crew, he was,
she
you know,
was-
was very abusive.
she was taunting him and talking all kinds of smack, and he finally just reacted. And it wasn't even a kick. I mean, God, the guy was like, I mean, if you're gonna kick somebody, you should really give him a whack. You know, he was like,
Yeah, well, I might disagree with you on.
Well, I know you.
Kick.
Yeah, no, I understand. But, you know, from my perspective, I thought, well, that was stupid to do it on film.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah,
you know, to be honest, I thought, God, Linda kind of deserved that.
she was asking for it.
She was
Okay.
totally asking for it. She was baiting him, trying to get him to do something, and he did it.
yeah.
Well,
yeah, there are people that kind of ask for it in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My mother was like that. My
So
dad
tell-
was a very gentle soul, but she could push him to the point where he would do something like that.
So tell me, how does that part of Bukowski translate into today's world of feminist empowerment, and how do you two, as I believe you're both poets,
Mhm.
how does that translate to how you are looking at Bukowski in a lens of today?
go ahead, Linda.
Well, there's a part of me, my shadow self or whatever, that's very dark and very angry and could get really violent if I were pushed. I don't, I haven't. But I can identify with that aspect of him, of his poems. And I find it very fascinating, psychologically, emotionally. So I liked what John was saying about his family history and the psychology behind that kind of behavior, and the way and what he wrote about, that how much sense all that makes, that when you're brought up in that kind of environment. So I have not only my shadow self that understands that behavior, but also I have this sympathy for him,
Yeah,
or a kind of empathy that he was a suffering soul.
well, and you can set aside the artist from the art. I mean, I don't have to love the artist to love the art.
Exactly.
That also is true.
Exactly.
That also.
Yeah. See, I love Bukowski's writing. Wasn't too keen on who Bukowski was as a person. So I basically just dealt with the writer.
Right,
People ask me about Bukowski, I'm talking about the words, not the persona.
right.
Right. But
Right.
I'm fascinated by the persona.
Well, it's certainly something.
I'm fascinated by it. So it isn't only the poetry for me. I love what he does with language, but I'm also fascinated by his sensibility and who he is, who he was.
So what we're left with, and in the final sort of analysis here, is a dichotomy between who the man is,
Yeah.
who the man was, in terms of his private life and his personal challenges, both with love and, relationships and all of that sort of thing. And who the man projected himself to be
Yeah.
in the writing, which was this sort of alter ego
Mm-hmm.
that was something about making himself larger than life. And the question is that somewhere between these two perspectives is in fact the real Bukowski,
Mm-hmm.
the guy who wrote The Bluebird Inside of Me,
Yeah.
the guy who wrote Dinosaurius We as a sort of fatalistic dystopian future, and the guy that wrote Democracy, which is the poem about, ask yourself why democracy doesn't work and just look at the next person you find on the street.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And all of that, much to John Dullahan's amazement, actually does resonate with the young 20 and 30 somethings
Yeah.
that are drinking over at the hip young beer bar down the street from my office.
Mm-hmm.
I love the poem that was read today. That was a brilliant poem. That's a brilliant piece of work. And I assume he wrote it, but I know there's a question mark, but it's a great poem.
No, I'm the one with the question mark. There's no actual
The one with the question mark.
It's
Mr.
me.
Dullahan is the one that found it in the
Brilliant.
published works. One, I think, the only settlement we can come to at this point is that John Martin would not have published that
Great poem.
poem in Bukowski's what is it, Night of the Earth poem?
Yeah.
If Bukowski had not written it.
Yeah.
There's also a reading, an audio that he did, that Bukowski did, I think about a year before he died. It was for a HarperCollins collection called Run with the Hunted, and he actually read that poem. So I would.
I found a video of him with him reading, and it has a picture of him, and he definitely didn't look like he was dying from leukemia. It looked like he was looked like how he looked in the 70s. So the recording was made in the 70s, and the voice that everyone says, oh yeah, he read this poem, it was so great. But I don't think that I can't imagine that Bukowski, on the verge of death, I mean 6 months out or so, maybe 7-8 months out from death, would sound like the guy on the tape or on the video.
I'd love to see that video.
I can let's hook up afterwards. I'll
Yeah,
send
yeah,
you
yeah.
I'll send you the link if I can find. I have it actually.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Let me see if I can put it into the
The chat here.
yeah, I'll just try and copy the address and see what happens.
Well, it's been engaging, folks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for your participation today. This interview, as well as some of the written stuff regarding Bukowski, is going to publish this week, or actually next week, because this is being filmed on Saturday, August 20th, a couple days after his, few days after his 100th birthday, in celebration of such. And you're all invited to check our website at randomlinksnews.com and or pick up a hard copy at your local bar, restaurant, and or public coffee house.
Does San Pedro actually have any dive bars left?
Oh, yes.
Seems like they've all been hippified, you know.
Well, I may as yet. I'm threatening to write a piece called "Bukowski Didn't Drink Here."
Yeah.
And,
People, it's amazing how many people think that Bukowski did his terrors in the bars in San Pedro.
no,
The
no,
time
no,
he got to San Pedro, he was like trying to keep a low profile.
no. The deal is this: about 2 decades ago, Ray Dieter, the guy who runs the tire store down the street, gave me um, a cabbie's cheat sheet for San Pedro that had about 36 bars, restaurants, and brothels in San Pedro that they would use for the military folks and whatnot that were trying to have a night out on the town, right? Okay. Of that list, there are perhaps 5 places left.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Okay, 5 places left.
And how many were on the original list? 50 or 100?
Oh, there was at least 3 or 4 dozen.
Yeah.
I mean, these were classic names.
We had the same thing in Long Beach, though, because
of course,
the Navy would come in through this town. I mean, 4th Street used to have the Navy would come in at one end, park their bags, and start working their way up to the end, and then come working their way back before the MPs picked them
the
up.
working girls of Long Beach could make a decent living.
Those were the days.
The Navy. The same was true in San Pedro. Okay, even though the civic league and the religious folks always sort of like turned a blind eye to this. As of now, there are maybe 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 dive bars left in San Pedro. And when my friends from the West Side come down here, they want to have the bar crawl in San Pedro because mostly a Bukowski. The truth of the matter is,
he drank up on Bandini, right? Or what was it? Street that he lived on?
Bukowski didn't drink here.
I know.
What he did,
it's crazy.
what I can guarantee you that he did was when he won at the racetrack, when he was feeling flush, he would go down to the 22nd Street landing and order, wine and lobster. Other times when he was trying to placate Linda, they would go down to Tasty Siam on the waterfront, which is no longer there, and they'd have Thai food. But the one place, the classic place that I would almost always see them would be as they called it, Sen Fuck You, which is the Japanese restaurant on 6th Street. And basically, they only serve beer and wine in there. So I only saw Bukowski drink beer and wine, and sometimes it was in volume. But he never went to the dive bars like the Alhambra or the Royale or the Spot or any of those places, any of the dive bars that have existed in the last few years. He wasn't there.
No.
He was not there. And I've had a drink in every bar that has been in San Pedro at one point or another. So that's all I can tell you. And so the article I may end up writing is Bukowski didn't drink here.
I love it. That's great.
Anyway, folks, it's been a pleasure to host you all today. Rain Dog, the publisher of Lummox Press in Long Beach. John Dullahan, the filmmaker with Born Into This. I will let you know that his videos, the video of that documentary is now available on our website, randomlinksnews.com. You can get a DVD, a brand new, unsealed DVD of the original born into this at the Random Links News website. And if you would like to refresh your memory about this conversation at some point in the near future, because your memory is failing, you can always find it on our Random Links News YouTube as of next Thursday, I believe. I'm hoping that that all comes to place. I thank you for your attendance today, and I hope you are all celebrating Mr. Bukowski tomorrow on his 100th birthday.
Yay! Thank you.